While talking about the recent updates on Disney's never-ending line of live-action films, I found myself stumbling on the biggest problem they've always managed to produce, and that, my friend, is the Disney princess problem, where over the past few years, the discourse surrounding these females have been quite negative with what they represent. The girls who long to be saved by a man from the older Disney stories and not having the agency or empowering messages they should have in modern times. One that was highlighted again by the action surrounding the Snow White remake and its main actress, whom everyone holds a lot of hatred for what is now known as, comparing to that of the original story, where because of that I was inspired to take a look at these conversations that have been going on for the past few years about these Disney princesses as a whole and beyond the brand itself, to remind myself what actually made them special in the first place, that people continue to hold the wrong opinions and really misrepresent on what they don't get about the very story at first. I mean, it's nice to improve upon the past in stories that were told over a half-century ago, but it's also stupid to really dismiss these characters for what they actually did. I mean, yes, there is a lot of old Disney content that are outdated by today's standards, including the ones that are blatantly racist in some regards, but that didn't mean everything they did was exactly like that or should be dismissed with what they actually had in their princess stories. Far from it, where it really did empower them as actual main protagonists of their very stories, starting out with Snow White itself. I mean, Disney could have started with a male hero, but they actually didn't do that and went with her instead to be that first lead beyond Mickey Mouse himself in feature animation. But apparently, with what we know now, Disney too does not actually think that that was good enough with what we see in every attempt in their own live action films, that likes to prop up every single female they have more so than their original counterparts, which most recently has been seen in the live action Little Mermaid, which egregiously replaces Eric with Ariel at the final battle to stab Ursula, where what we constantly see in these films really adds unnecessary changes to the female characters that misunderstand what they actually really did for them originally and those around them, just because a few people couldn't really see that on the surface level, where for the most part, they try to attempt to paint these decisions as neutral, where despite how minor they actually seem, you can really tell that this was the overall intention if you were a fan or watched the original previously, clear an intent to rewrite the actions of old to fit in with the new. And because of that and the problem that continues to persist, I thought it'd be best to really highlight the importance of what the Disney princesses already bring that so many people really don't understand today, and also explaining why newer ones actually work as well on their own that don't need remakes or Disney's arbitrary definition of princesses, considering the official media franchise that includes characters like Moana and Mulan in that very lineup. Like, I really don't care what you actually say, this is still a problem on my part I have personally when they are both not actually princesses themselves. Mulan is a warrior hero of China who never married a royal, and Moana is the daughter of the chief, where even she said that herself. I do not care what Maui or Disney says in this case, she is not a princess and just a regular Disney character, where they keep undermining real ones like Kida from Atlantis just because its box office wasn't that great when it was released, where we should accept that as well. Other princesses that actually prove many other diverse arguments that should be celebrated, and of course other characters like Anna in that too, because she was a princess and was a part of Disney's most popular animated film. But besides that issue, let's just start with the underlying issues that many misunderstand, beginning with Snow White herself. Now, I've already really talked about Snow White in great detail concerning the upcoming live action film, where I really actually explained how her character was very strong and independent in her own unique way, that people like Rachel that actually starring in the film that I highlighted disrespect the original, stating it was a backward story because of these things like she longs for true love and the prince to save her, where now we really don't need to do that and actually empower her character instead. But when you highlight problems like that, you highlight something that wasn't even a major plot point to the entire story. Yes, she longs for love, but that's just like what any other girl would actually want. It isn't a bad thing to actually want love in your life, especially if you had that love shut out from your own evil stepmom who wants to kill you after abusing you to work as a slave to be the fairest of them all. Like, it's already established at the beginning that Snow White had a poor upbringing despite being a princess, with her real parents actually dying when she was young and then taken into the hands of the evil queen as her new stepmom, a woman in a position of power who abuses that to get what she wants for herself rather than the others, like her own stepdaughter in this case. She betters herself rather than those she actually raises in her own family, and in the face of such adversity, she carried on hopeful, working hard for the day she finally gets something that gives her meaning beyond what she's working as a scullery maid. And when she runs away from her mother who sent the hunters after her, she finds a bit of freedom tidying hitting up the dwarves' home before they come home, where she eventually makes a deal with them to cook for them so that she could stay here. I highlight this because some people also don't like the fact that she does things for the dwarves when in fact she willingly actually wanted to, in order to have a place to stay for that very time, where they would have actually done that regardless because of the fact she was kind of an angel to them and offered something in return that they actually mutually understood and accepted. And as a result of this, being in charge of dinner and whatnot, she comes across as a mother-like figure, taking command of what they needed to do before eating, like washing their hands because they were dirty working in the mine, that she valued cleanliness and actually demanded that they would actually do that. She demonstrates several traits of leadership without the modern girl boss definitions that most people actually want in these movies nowadays, like the new Snow White film, that many really overlook every single detail that the film had for being birthed in 1937, and that's really sad. Missing character development and appreciation for a film that really did birth a new age. Like, why should we go back and shame these old stories when they were the first of their kind in this new medium, adapting stories over 100 years old that was actually based over a few hundred more? It really doesn't make sense why many would actually dismiss it on what we know now in society rather than appreciate what came before it to really get us to the point we know now. We could never have these characters like Mulan and so forth had this actually not existed, where it's actually fine to have such a variety of characters, where Cinderella adapted upon Snow White a bit better and of course saved Disney again at the time. I mean, yes, nowadays the original Cinderella movie isn't as great as what we know now, but looking back upon it and what Disney has mostly done for the character, including the live action film and the sequels except for 2, it showed that they actually understood the story rather than bring it down, highlighting the important elements and expanding upon it to make it a great story. But that still didn't mean it had its problems that people highlighted, where most notably back in 2018, actress Keira Knightley banned her daughter from watching this film and The Little Mermaid, stating that this film was just her waiting for a rich guy to rescue her in the end. But like Snow White in this very case, the fucking prince was hardly in the movie at all and didn't even have a character until Cinderella 3. I swear, if any of you tried to mention Cinderella 2 to me, I will bibbidi bobbidi boot your ass out of here, because the main focus of these films are on the princesses themselves. In this case, Cinderella isn't a princess until the very end because the focus is on her, about growing up with her stepfamily just like Snow White while being abused by them, and also staying true to herself along the way to better herself in the end. She already demonstrates traits of independence, where getting saved by a man is quite literally the last thing on her mind. They are just a bonus to the film in getting what they actually want in the end, but they actually had much more to it to get to that very point. She is even tested at times where Lady Tremaine demands her not to go to the ball for her own chance to spend time with the public until the fairy godmother comes, being tested throughout if she thinks she's worthy of actually achieving her own goals. But she doesn't waver or crack and still remains to be a positive and very feminine role model to those around her, where she has a point to actually prove. I mean, she can leave at any time, but she would actually have nothing to grow from or an actual place to stay. How there is a reason to why the hero must stay with the villain to imply the lessons that are actually being taught in the film. And like I said, if you aren't convinced by the portrayal of the original 1950 film, then you can actually watch the 2015 live action film to actually see it explained better, where like I said, this is the only live action remake that gets what the original had without ruining it. It demonstrates the same traits as before, with a more emphasis on her background and other human characters rather than the over-focus on the mice. It's not to say the original was bad in any way, they just actually expanded upon the actual character story a bit more while still respecting it overall. It's just really astonishing how this film actually gets what was being conveyed in a better storytelling setting that people really don't give any thought to. How any problem they had was actually easily solved by the overall message about these films in a nutshell, giving more time to other characters like the prince as well to set aside his hopes and dreams similar to Cinderella's. It's all about what she wanted to do and uphold what her parents actually set out for her, where she herself just happened to connect with the prince in that very process. And I think it's very important to highlight that as well because of what Snow White's new movie is trying to teach of what is being implied by this new film. That it really forgets the film that it originally continued the same character development and hardly needed to change to that point that was being conveyed with what they're trying to do now. That these females are more than what you see and lead on with kindness and compassion and really stay true to who they really are, where that is something that really needs to be seen now. And if you were going to remake these stories, then at least try to do with what Cinderella did, where no other live action film has ever been able to successfully do for some reason. Where throughout, it clearly doesn't mention her longing for a prince, unlike Snow White. A dream is a wish your heart makes, where the important lyrics to highlight are, no matter how your heart is grieving, if you keep believing, that dream that you wish will come true. That no matter what happens in your situation, if you have faith to see it through, then it will come true, which it did in the very end, where we see the opportunity given to every maiden in the kingdom, where she gets married in the end and lives happily ever after. And if you ignore that, then you ignore everything about why people actually love these characters in the first place, where you only choose certain points on face value and you really don't open yourself to the story that's being presented, like these actors and actresses have demonstrated being ignorant to actually allowing these kids to actually watch this. It's very stupid and selfish arrogance in my opinion that doesn't allow any open-ended discussion or conversations on these very topics and certain role models that are actually being presented. I mean, if you actually want a real discussion, then we should discuss how Disney never really developed their men quite right at this very time, which is disappointing because they really could have had a story but was actually pushed aside in favor of these females instead until Sleeping Beauty actually rolled around, where Aurora wasn't actually a main focus of the film overall, not actually being shown a lot, where it really wanted to show the kingdom as a whole working to protect her like the fairies who raised her, and of course actually giving the prince more character like Philip in this case who defeated Maleficent. I mean, it is such a beautifully animated film that also tried to add a lot more, but not as much for Aurora in this case. This is more justifiable to the criticisms most people have of these Disney princes and what they say for Cinderella and Snow White, where the two previous princesses had clearly more character than she did, where it's alright if you want to criticize that, but it's true that the main focus wanted to be more on the subjects of the kingdom and whatnot around that, and I think it was just fine. But what's not right to criticize is the next big princess in Ariel herself from The Little Mermaid, who is probably still the most misunderstood Disney princess to date, and only heightened by the live action remake that was just so painfully awful. The main criticism again is giving up her life under the sea for a man, how she makes a deal with Ursula to give up her voice so that she could actually spend time with her, which is what most people perceive on the surface as the wrong message to actually send to little girls. But those who actually do say that and believe in it full-heartedly really didn't even watch the movie at all, because once again, like the last two princesses, this was not the point of the fucking movie and her character. This is something I highlighted in full detail in my review of the new movie, where it was clear that Ariel's motivation was to be a part of the human world rather than just Eric, where Eric was just another bonus that was more highlighted compared to the previous stories, that it follows the same trend as the last two princesses and actually does more for Ariel's character in this place. Yes, she loves Eric, but even before that, she still wanted to do anything to long for the human world overall when she wasn't actually allowed to do so at the time, that her father tries to impose these strict rules on her that doesn't allow her to actually grow as an actual person. The main point about this film is for King Triton to change in a reflection to how parents hold on to something like their own kids for too much without regards to what they actually want when they eventually grow up, to become their own persons in their life and actually seeking something better for themselves. And that's something many actually connected to in regards to Ariel, being a teenager longing for something that gives her life actual meaning to what she is actually a part of. And if you don't let people see that, then you actually set them up for misinformation that erases the other qualities that these protagonists can have, that actually relates to a large portion of human beings, only adhering to one ideology and nothing more than that, to be something they can't because it's only pushing one way rather than actually doing it for the movie and story that people actually love overall. And of course, the remake in this case refused to understand this by how much they propped her up beyond that point without knowing what actually happened around her. I mean, they tried to convey the same point, but it's more obvious where the intention was going here while removing the points the story had, like the ending where she has to steer the ship into Ursula rather than Eric, where the original did it so that Triton can actually understand that not all humans are bad, that what she does is worthy of being defended for love, and showcasing that Ariel's point of view was actually just in what she believed in, and where they actually removed that point and only freed her because that was in the original story. Like, everything they do in the remake hardly is justified by what they misunderstand that was originally brought forth. And of course, this is also continued by the fact that they regress Ariel despite saying they make her a big focus by putting Scuttle under the sea rather than her going to the surface, where she already demonstrates traits of independence secretly, doing things for love of the human world, that there are more to the character than what people see, that she gives a voice for a man, which is thinking more like Ursula, who doesn't care about her, rather than going into her own perspective that actually sees more about the human world and what she wants. These characters are clearly victims that long for more in their life but aren't able to do so by their abusive parents. I mean, Triton the least in this case, because he actually cares and loves his daughter, where the same can be said for Ariel for her father, but for the others in this case, they are step-parents that only care for themselves rather than who they raise, and that's really admirable for what they are able to accomplish to actually get out of the situation, that they have flaws and they are able to overcome them in the end. Not everyone should be perfect, and they should actually come with certain traits that aren't described to being perfect. Like, knowing all of that is where you actually have to watch the films to see what they are like rather than dismiss them like most people actually do nowadays with these movies and whatnot, and what others actually think of the character on surface view, because the last time they actually watched these films was when they were 9 or something. And remember, Disney themselves are also bad at actually understanding this too, with newer films that I actually produced, like Ralph Breaks the Internet with their own princess scene, the one where Belle in Rapunzel says to Vanellope if she was kidnapped or enslaved.
Were you poisoned? No. Cursed? No. Kidnapped or enslaved? No.
And this creates the most stupid stupidest thing ever said in one of the most stupidest movies ever created, because this also presents a problem that whoever wrote this Disney movie never really watched Beauty and the Beast at all. Because Belle was never actually kidnapped, nor was she ever enslaved at any point by the Beast, and actually chose to free her father by actually taking his place in the castle to stay with him forever as that punishment, that he understands what she is doing and doesn't really actually harm her in her stay in the castle, where instead it actually allows him to grow with her as a character to break the curse in the end of the film. And it's really shameful this is presented, because this film is actually regarded as one of Disney's best and one of the greatest animated films ever made. We're seeing scenes like this that Disney themselves produce in their very own princess scene is just really shameful and continues the lack of knowledge that the leadership truly has to their own stories. Belle is a strong Disney princess because she willingly gives her life for others in this film despite the circumstances and not being an empowered superhero or whatnot that most modern definitions describe. And that's not the worst part, where the lack of Disney princess knowledge actually continued on with Rapunzel herself in this very scene for a movie that only came out 8 years before this one, where she says this egregious line.
Do people assume all your problems got solved because a big strong man showed up?
The big strong man line is truly pathetic and in line with every other criticism older Disney films have had, being saved by the man who wasn't really in the film at all, and ignores everything that she went through herself in her adventure with Eugene, who both him and Rapunzel were actually co-protagonists in that very film. He was not a big strong man who actually saved her. He was the opposite, where he originally thought more about himself and she hit him at first, but they went along making an actual deal to actually satisfy themselves, and over time actually understood each other and fell in love. So to say this line that comes out of the mouth of her specifically was just very insulting to her as a character and her very movie that keeps Disney to rewrite all their princesses for the worse. So to come out of Disney themselves for this movie with those 2 points just feels so degrading to their original stories, just because of what people actually think of these characters without fully actually understanding them. Because the traits they have specifically is what leads them to other characters we know now like Mulan and Moana, who aren't Disney princesses in reality but still there because that's what the franchise includes nowadays. Or if you are a female hero, you somehow get included in that case, except for Frozen for some reason, because that franchise is just way too successful for its own good. But for what Disney says, I'm going to include them in this case because of what they built on the success of the previous ones, where both Mulan and Moana are my favorite Disney heroes that were ever created, where they are ones that say fit the mode of modern empowering female role models, breaking gender norms and proving their own worth, but actually showcasing it in a very respectful manner and such. Because when you actually look at it, Mulan actually doesn't break it just because to break gender norms like most are perceived to be written as such now, but she does it more for the sake of her family, really trying to save her father from dying in battle. The thing she does in this film is done out of the love and honor of her family and not for herself to try to prove a point. That at first we see she can never be the girl that others like her family think she is to bring honor to those old traditional roles, where her entire personality is actually different from that and her character as all. It's done in this way that makes more sense to her character, that gives respect to all involved, but actually done out of obligation to defend what she thinks is right and going off to war to prevent her father from suffering a deadly fate to save her country as well. Where we constantly see throughout she does things beyond physical capabilities with her own intelligence and problem solving skills to defeat the enemy. That she shows other ways to actually solve things while retaining her feminine qualities after she is revealed to be a woman. She does things more out of her sense of duty rather than becoming a man at the very end, in the sense of a girl boss or whatever people actually think about. I mean, yeah, she may not fit the traditional mode of what the society expects, but it doesn't mean she ignores or disregards any of her feminine traits, which she clearly has, but just wants to be more free-spirited and determined to accomplish her goals in a different setting. Where even at the end of the film, she actually turns down a position of power given by the Emperor himself to actually go ahead and spend time with her own family. That above all, with what actually happened in the events of the film, that is what really mattered to her, to defend what she actually cares much about, rather than power for the sake of it, especially with what we see in her own father, who loves her very much. It's just that we see that there's so much more to these characters than what everyone has actually taken for granted, and it just follows what the other princesses were good at, following their hearts for their families for the better, like what Belle did for her father and what Ariel did to change her father's view, and how Cinderella and Snow White proved their abusive stepmoms actually wrong. And it's a trait that actually still continued on with Moana once again, who reflected the qualities of the princesses I just mentioned, doing things for her family for the better of her people and not trying to prove a point that she's the strong independent female, where she's actually being groomed to be the next chief eventually from the get-go. Her strength is longing to better her own people despite what her father says that actually restricts them, all done for the sake of safety in this case, just like what Triton did to Ariel in a different way. which both ironically were directed by Musker and Clements, so it actually made sense with what they actually got. I mean, other than Maui in this film, there really isn't a big strong man helping to save the day either, and it's just more about her character and what she actually struggles throughout. She isn't flawless and doubts herself constantly if she can actually do it, almost actually wanted to quit near the very end, but still pushes through because of who she is and why she was chosen for a reason by the ocean. These are reasons why I love her character so much as my favorite Disney protagonist ever, because she has those flaws and actually pushes through, having those traits that longs for something greater in her own life without putting people down about it, that she actually cares so much about them and is willing to do whatever it takes to get there even if it isn't allowed, and sees the good in others like Maui to see it through. She follows the same path as the others because they're all determined to see their problems through to the very end in their own unique way that lifts others up for the most part and really doesn't bring them down for the sake of it like the other modern stories show. That you can't really get characters like Moana unless you had others like Snow White to begin that actually preceded her all the way back, where she is clearly inspired with what she demonstrated at first, that they are all strong in their own right and have nothing that should be changed about it, unlike with what Rachel has clearly demonstrated in her lack of knowledge about the character. Because looking back from Snow White onward, most Disney princesses has the same flaws as anyone else and chooses to push through in their own unique way. Tiana has this, Anna has this, and so forth, where they're just flawed, imperfect human beings, and that's actually very fine, where we really don't need these pathetic changes in these pathetic remakes to actually lift them up to be paragons of society, because they really aren't. Yes, most are royals from the get-go, but it doesn't mean they should be lifted to a higher standard because they actually struggle in their own unique way like any human should. And this disappointment actually started with Emma Watson's portrayal as Belle in the live-action remake, where it was very clear with how they wrote the characters around there and what she does that they were actually starting with, that they really wanted to start with the strong, independent, powerful angle for the female characters, where it was very clear from the start she wasn't actually the best choice for the role, not really carrying the kindness and compassion that Paige O'Hara actually brought to the original animated Belle. That she actually had more to a character than meets the eye that actually cared, rather than just one trait that's actually being propped up. Or then again, that is another issue that showed with Naomi Scott's portrayal as Jasmine, that actually got her own tonally awful song that never actually needed to be there, because that was not the point at all to be expressed, which was already clearly shown in the original by her interactions with Aladdin and the common folk to see away from what her father did, upholding a tradition, just doing so many things that are unnecessary to add just for the sake of it. Or like I said once again, in Halle Bale's portrayal as Ariel still took that away from the true focus of what the original taught in the first place, where of course it was all finally mashed together in the egregious portrayal of Mulan in 2020 by Yifei Liu that makes her a fucking superhero that clearly wasn't the actual point of what she could do as a character. But I think the worst part of all of this is how underrated Atlantis is always in this conversation, that really includes Disney's forgotten princess that they hardly care about anymore, in Princess Kida. The reason they don't include her in this list is because of the fact that they pressed that this movie wouldn't actually make them any money, and money is the only thing that actually matters rather than characters to be celebrated. Because Kida is a favorite of mine, because she too is another princess that is willing to help her people in this situation that has been living underground for centuries for their past mistakes, where she longs to actually fix it for the better as a warrior princess, trying to help these new explorers like Milo Thatch to solve the mystery and looking forward to what the world is actually like now. She is a warrior princess who seeks to solve the problems that her city faces, and ones people would actually find interesting in modern times with her culture and what the movie actually represents overall, that is truly diverse compared to other Disney films that have came out since, where that is the fact that Disney should really promote if they actually want to go for that angle for the better, but instead shelter that for the worse, where no one actually really cares about the story or even know that she's a princess until they actually watch this very movie. Not many people actually dresses up as her for most of the time and go for the more popular ones that the company constantly promotes instead. Like, why are we choosing to ignore this when she actually has a mix of qualities that people could actually respect for Disney princesses? Why can't we have more newer faces that prop up these stories rather than destroy the old ones for the sake of modern sensitivities? Like, why do you really need to constantly do this when you were perfectly fine with other portrayals like what Lily James brought to Cinderella that matches the original one voiced by Eileen Woods? How both stories actually understand each other rather than bring them down like the newer ones actually do. Where I really just think if you really want newer versions of these princesses, then just really make newer original ones instead, because it clearly worked for newer ones like Moana and so forth, Akita, where you can still keep the older ones as staples and guides for the newer generation, where just having them there just showcases how there are other ways that people can actually solve their problems without having to be what modern corporate society actually wants them to be. It's just so painful to constantly bring these problems up when they have already explained themselves over the past few years, but still important important to show these points so that people can actually understand them, that we shouldn't actually drag the older ones down because of what they represented for the time when they were released, but actually praise for initiating the pathway of females in animated storytelling, that they are clearly enjoyed for the better, that unless everyone actually realizes these points, then we will just see Disney be constantly fine with pushing out repackaged garbage down the general public's throats, and nothing good would actually change from it, just becoming more divisive as a result. It is just how these stories are made for the good of creativity and the ability to create diverse storytelling that actually can come in many different places, where the princess really highlight what that's all about and why they actually serve as an inspiration for our childhoods and actually growing up in our own unique paths and lives. Where it's just come to the point where I'm just becoming so sick of Disney and many other people, especially big celebrities, pushing the narrative to their own story that they really aren't strong females, because they clearly are and clearly do come from relatable backgrounds when you actually take a look into their very stories. That they, above all from Snow White and so forth, represent persistence and the ability to keep in good faith as you go to achieve your dreams for the best life that you can have. And if you realize that and what they actually provided, then they will last until the end of time. And with that said, I'm all done, so goodbye.